Hello and welcome to George's Family Matters Live with George Haraz. Today is December 14th, 2016, and in the week ahead, we have tomorrow, which is Thursday, Losing Your Birth Family with Carlos Haraz, A Little Boy's Confusion. On Friday, we have the Week in Review with you. Um, let's talk about what matters to your family. Um, This is our second week. We're up to over 450 viewers for last week, and we're kind of really happy with that. We have a lot to go over in today's show, so I'm going to get to that. Later in the show, we're going to talk about how to tell a struggling soul that there is love in this world. And we're also going to talk about what every child really wants. For today's show, it's Foster and Adoption 101 with Carolyn Goodridge, the basics, the basic ABCs. We have on the phone with us tonight Carolyn Goodridge. She is a foster and adoption specialist for over 30 years, specializing in older children. She knows her stuff, and we have her on the phone. Carolyn, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. How are you doing?
Fine.
Good. Um, Carolyn, I told a little bit about what you do, that you've been a professional in this for 30 years, specializing in older kids, but can you get into more detail about what you've done in your career?
Oh, yes. I think my interest started even earlier because my parents were foster parents when I was young, and I saw it from the children's side back then. Then I went to college and I majored in sociology and English, thinking I might go into teaching, but as I worked more with the Indian reservations near the college and got more into the sociology, I decided to minor in psychology so I could go into that field. My first 2 years back in Connecticut, I worked in the department of, it used to be the welfare department back then. It later became the Department of Children and Families. I spent 2 years there, and then I got married and decided to move to Maine, and I got a job at a private agency in Maine, which wanted me to start a child program, an older child placement program there. They had only been an infant agency up to that point. So I worked there for 11 years, and then I took some time off to be a full-time mom. And then when I moved back to Connecticut, I worked for Downside, which was a national agency placing only older children. And I worked there 16 years, and I've been at an agency which is an advocacy for foster and adoptive parents for the past 7 years. So I've always had the interest and work with foster care and adoption.
Mm-hmm. And let's just start simple. With foster care, what exactly is foster care?
Well, every state in the country has a foster care program, usually run by the public agency, where they recruit families and train families to care for children when their birth parents can't safely care for them. So the children come into care either by neglect or abuse, and they stay in foster care until the birth parents can rehabilitate or until they decide the children can't go back to the parents.
Okay, and with the foster care system, that's a federal program, correct? That states are
Well,
mandated to have?
I think they're mandated to have some kind of child protection. Each state has some flexibility as to how they run it, but there is a public agency in every state that handles the safety and protection of children.
So it won't be the same state to state. Some states have Department of Children's Services, some have Child Protection Services, so they have different names and they run a little differently, but it's basically the same thing.
Right, and their emphasis in all the states is the protection of children. So their trainings and their hirings and everything else are related to keeping children safe, removing children from homes. So they don't always have their own adoption programs. Sometimes um, they work with private agencies in those states to provide the adoption end, but they always would take care of the protective end.
Okay. And Carolyn, what is adoption?
In almost every state, it's defined as the legal transfer of parenting rights and responsibilities from one family to another. And the intention is for it to be permanent, but we know sometimes that doesn't happen. Um, but it's a legal transfer, so once the adoption actually occurs in court, the adoptive parents are the legal parents in every respect.
Mm-hmm. And do some states mix the two where they say that if you want to adopt, if it's going to be a child that's in the foster care system, you're going to do foster care for the first year? How does that work?
Well, for many years, when I first started working in the field, it was very separate routes. If somebody wanted to be an adoptive parent, they were discouraged from being a foster parent because all these agencies don't know what's going to happen to the child when they first come into care. And someone who really wants to adopt would be attaching to that child and hoping the child's going to stay with them. And then if the child has to return home, sometimes it can sabotage the placement without maybe their intentions, but because the child senses that this family really wants them to stay. So they used to tell people you couldn't do foster care if you wanted to adopt. But in recent years, because there's been all the studies showing that every placement of a child is damaging, they've tried to say when a child first comes into care, even at the emergency stage, that they ask the family if they would be willing to continue with that child if the child became legally free at a later date. So they're trying to find legal risk placements where the child isn't legally free for adoption, but if the family is willing to consider adoption at the end, then the child wouldn't have to make another move.
And you mentioned that it's damaging to the child with each transition. In what way?
Well, there's a big emphasis on attachment, and if every time a child moves and has to attach to new caregivers, it affects how they attach because every time they leave a previous caregiver, they're building up little walls around themselves to protect themselves. And it's the same for all of us um, when we have to move somewhere, when we leave a job, when we lose a pet. All of these things cause us to build a little wall around ourselves to protect ourselves so it doesn't happen again. So then with each new relationship, you may not be as open to accepting that relationship because you've built these walls to protect yourself.
Carolyn, to make it a little easier for people to understand, I'd like to throw an analogy out there and maybe you can build upon it. When we first start dating in life, in our teens, we date like wild. It's, you just date all the time and you're out there. But as we get into older ages, if we're still dating or if we find ourselves dating again, we have those walls because we've had a lot of experiences. We have a lot of things that we didn't care for. Is that kind of what happens where you start to kind of protect yourself because you kind of know, oh, well, these parents, they're going to do this? Is that a fair way to explain it? How would you explain it in an adult way?
Well, that is a good analogy because it happens to all of us, and I always said in the classes that if somebody has an attachment issue, they can be on this long spectrum. Some people will have the walls so high that you have to chip away every day, try to get it down enough to even carry on a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But other people will be able to accept the transitions a little bit better, and they won't have such a high wall, and they'll be able to let the wall down in less time. So it affects people differently. Even if you have 4 children in a family and they all experience the same thing, like a car accident, every child will respond to that differently because they're all different people and different personalities. One child might carry that accident with them as this big burden for the rest of their life, where another one will be able to get over the trauma much quicker.
But if
So
there's
it's a
multiple accidents happening every month or a couple of months, then you can end up with a child that finds it even harder to let go of.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And the more moves that each child has, the more the chances are that they're going to have a big wall built up because they don't trust people. Part of a relationship is always building that trust and being able to trust that this person is going to be there for them. And each time a child has to move again to another home, they take a lot longer to begin to trust.
Carolyn, what causes the moves? What causes the child to have to move from one foster home to the other? Are there typical causes?
It's there's a lot of different reasons. Many times it happens that because the agency doesn't think the foster home is managing the transitions well, because the children do visit their birth parents as much as they can, especially in the beginning. In case they do get reunified and go back home, they want to make sure that relationship is continuing. And sometimes the foster family may be reluctant to go along with the visits because it's upsetting. The child's going to have reactions when they leave the family to come back to foster care or vice versa. So it's hard on the foster families to see what's happening to the child, and they may try to put up roadblocks to prevent the visits from occurring. And that may cause the agency to move the child rather than try to fight over it all the time. But it's not always best for the child either to have to move because of something like that.
Mm-hmm. And Carolyn, with those moves, when children are moved from home to home, what's the typical number? Is there a typical number that kids are? I know that they try to minimize it. Is there a typical number of times that you find that kids are moved around before they're adopted? Is it once? Do they go to a foster home and just stay?
That would be wonderful if that only happened. And with legal risk homes, it is happening more than it used to.
What does a
Because,
legal risk home mean?
well, it means that the family is taking the child in as a foster child, and then if the child does become free for adoption, if they end up terminating the parents' rights, then the family would be able to adopt. So there is a legal risk involved because the child is not legally free when they're placed with the family.
So the child might go back to
They
the.
might go back to their parents, or they might have to move on for some reason, but hopefully not. But getting back to your typical number, I think the majority of children under age 8 usually have fewer placements, so hopefully they would be lucky enough to only have the move from their birth parents to the foster home and then maybe stay there. Occasionally the foster family may find they don't want to adopt, and that could be if the birth family is very involved and has been constantly involved through the whole process. The family may feel it's too close a tie to be able to go on with an adoption. So sometimes the child moves from the foster home to another home to be adopted. But the majority of the younger children usually don't move as many times, but I have seen some children with 4 or 6 moves even when they're fairly young. The older children, it's really baffling how many times some of these children move, and they count a move even if they have to go to a hospital for a period of time
Mm-hmm.
and then back again. So each one of those is a move in the child's mind because they're never sure they're going to go back to the same place. and sometimes they don't. So,
Well, I had adopted 9 children, which you're aware of. We've talked about that. And the first group was moved many, 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 many times, including to a safe house, to different homes, taken out as in an emergency situation where there was a problem with the foster home. They were taken out of that home. So, looking back, I asked one of my kids about that, and he said that was probably one of the hardest things for him is to keep being moved around because he always felt like it was his fault. He wasn't wanted. He wasn't lovable. Do you find that that's typical amongst foster children?
oh yeah, they always blame themselves. They blame themselves for whatever happened to their parents too. Even if there was the worst scenario might be that the child witnessed one parent killing the other parent. But in their minds, they're thinking, if I had only been better, if I hadn't misbehaved, maybe they wouldn't have gotten mad at each other and ended up doing that. So the child still blames themselves for things that they had no control over.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it's so, it affects the children so badly.
It's very true. One of my kids actually, well, they all witnessed it, but one of them had a really hard time witnessing the biological father putting a gun into the mother's face, maybe even into her mouth. It was just, all over the place while police tried to enter. It was just a nightmare situation. And he blamed himself for that. Matter of fact, he needed a lot of therapy to deal with that, that it wasn't his fault, that as a little boy, he wasn't able to stop that. It took him years, well, initially months, but then years to really accept it and really understand it.
Yeah, it does. And little children feel like they have this godlike power that they control
Hmm.
everything. And sometimes the children who were neglected or didn't have a constant caregiver when they were really little, they learned to take care of themselves because they couldn't trust an adult to be there. So they think they have power to do all these things, and so they take that blame as well because they think it was their fault. If anything happened, it was always their fault. So it does leave a real brand on a child when they feel that way.
Yep. Now, Carolyn, I'm going to put a number up on the screen, and the number is a wrong number, so I'm going to take the number off the screen. Um, I'm going to take the number off. We're going to try again in a minute. And yeah, that was not good. Our phone number here is 202 999 4699. That's 202 999 4699. I'll put the number back up in a few minutes, probably while you're answering the next question. Um, I'll work on getting that number up again. Carolyn, so most kids then do not go right into adoption unless it's an identified adoption as a baby, and we'll talk about the different types of adoptions. But for most kids, it's foster care, then into adoption.
Right, because foster care, by its nature, was planned to be a temporary situation to help families who were having struggles being parents to get things together and then they could get their children back. So the main idea of foster care is that the child comes in, they have a safe place to stay, but that there would be constant back and forth with their birth parents so that they can hopefully reunite and get back home. And in the meantime, the agency is supposed to work with the birth parents to help them get, if it's drugs or alcohol, to help them get that rehabilitation. If they just need help finding housing, jobs, that type of thing, they do that. So it's mainly to help the family get back together. So the
Okay.
adoption is the end piece if that cannot happen, if the rehabilitation can't happen.
And I don't know if there's statistics on it. Is there a percentage of times, is it, that you could talk about in terms of how often do the kids end up going back home?
Right now, it's been. I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but from what I've been reading in the past few years, because there's more and more emphasis on reunification or going to a relative, but the return home reunification, it has been at least 50%, and maybe even up to towards 60%.
Nice. Has that
So,
changed from years in the past?
oh yeah, yeah, and a lot had to do with attitudes of the agencies. Um, Whoever's running the agency, if they have a judgment against some of the birth parents. For instance, one thing we noticed several years ago, we learned that a lot of children were removed from parents who had any kind of mental illness. It didn't matter what it was. If they had a diagnosis of mental illness, the child would be removed and the rights terminated fairly quickly. What they've learned in recent years with all the research and everything on the brain and on mental illness, they're finding that a lot of these parents can manage if they have some support and if they have medication, and so that's no longer a reason to remove children. So the attitudes have changed a lot in the last 30 years that I've seen. There's been a big change in the attitude of the agency toward the birth parents and the attitudes of some of the foster parents toward the birth parents. Because now they train foster parents a little differently. They have the foster parent meet the birth parent as soon as possible so they can compare notes and try to raise the child in a similar way. And the birth parents have less fear of the foster parents, so there might be more cooperation there. And sometimes the birth parents decide that they want the foster parents to raise their child because they see that the child is doing better and is happy there. So having that relationship has helped. Of course, there are some families who would never be able to do that if they're a family that's incarcerated and has all kinds of aggression and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But an awful lot of them are working out pretty well, where they work together and the foster parents go into it with that idea, and they work well together.
Okay. Carolyn, I want to invite people again to call our number if they have questions for you about what we're talking about, comments, stories that they want to share, anything like that. Our number is 202-999-4699. Carolyn, I want to move into into the child moving into the home. So far we have them in foster care. They go into adoption. What is it like for them usually when adoption happens? Is that a real happy, joyful time for them? How would you describe that? Because now they're being adopted into what I hear adoption agencies all the time call their forever home.
Hmm. Um, for some children, I used to warn the adoptive parents about that because for some children, they don't find out that they're not going back home until after a termination of parental rights has been done. And that is the step just before going into an adoptive home. So the termination, no one's going to prepare the child for the grief or the announcement that you're never going back home, which is the answer after a termination of parental rights. So the child has to grieve that at some point, and if the agency placing the child doesn't do some work with them, with a therapist or whatever, now many agencies used to do life books with the kids where they would go over all their placements and what happened in each one and why they're going to move on to this permanent home. But a lot of agencies don't have the time anymore to do that, so it may end up on the adoptive parent's lap to do that work. And the child might need to have some grieving time. It's not necessarily a bad thing in a sense, because if you're the one there comforting that child when they're going through their grief,
Mm-hmm.
it can bring you closer together. But the adoptive parents have to realize that the child isn't going to come rushing in full of smiles and appreciate everything you give them right away, because they just aren't capable of doing that.
Well, Carolyn, I just want to put a plug in for George's Family Matters, the website. There are materials in there in the resource center, and people can call us if they're not seeing what they're looking for, or they have no idea even what they're doing. We can put them on the right track. But it's not always a happy time for a child coming into a home. Some of them it is, and some of them have that honeymoon where it's only for a little while. But to prepare the parents for that and to have some books that you can read and study ahead of time is hugely helpful to know what's coming, more or less, how to handle it ahead of time. So when it really happens, you're prepared for it. You're not caught blindsided or not recognizing some things that could be big. Because you're right, the grieving time is an excellent time for the new parent to comfort them and talk about the parent. I think that a lot of parents adoptive parents tend to just want to pretend that it didn't happen and forget about it, but you can't pretend. It really happened, and the child needs to grieve and say goodbye and needs to have closure on it. So we do have a lot of materials on that for people. Karen, there's a lot of different kinds of adoptions. Can you talk about the different types of adoptions? Because it's not what we've talked about. Let me just say this. What we've talked about so far is through Department of Children and Families, Child Protection Services, whatever your state calls it. It's through state agencies. What else is there?
Well, you have what used to be the only kind of adoption more than 30 years ago was the infant adoption, where the birth parent would voluntarily place their child for adoption, and sometimes they chose the family the child was going to live with. In the 40s and 50s, most of those people were married couples that just couldn't afford another child. But as it got into the 50s and 60s, there were more and more unwed mothers who felt it wasn't the right time in their life to have a child and try to raise the child as a single parent. Also, at that time, there was no welfare. There was no support from the family for a single mother. It was against society's morals at that time to have a child out of wedlock. So the stigma was much worse than it is for mental illness or anything else nowadays. So many of those young women back then they gave up the child, but it wasn't necessarily totally voluntarily, because they were told by their families, you go away, have this child, and you come back without the child. And so that's what's happening now with a lot of the people looking for their birth parents, because they just felt like they didn't really want to give up that child back then. And many of those infants didn't have any information at all about themselves. One of
Carolyn,
the other...
oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
okay, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I'll remember my question.
Okay. One of the other forms of adoption that really doesn't involve the child changing is a step-parent adoption. And that's when the mother may have the child, or sometimes it's the father, and there's been a divorce or a death in the family. They remarry, and they want their new spouse to adopt the child so the child can have the same name and they have that parent. So in those cases, it often does involve a death of a parent, but it can be in a divorce, or maybe there was never a marriage in the beginning. If the father is still alive, they would have to sign permission for that adoption to take place, because they're still the legal parent.
Would that parent allowing the adoption, do they lose their parental rights, or does that child
Oh,
now
yeah.
have three parents?
No, technically they have to give up their rights to be able to
Hmm.
allow the adoption to happen, so they are no longer the legal parent of that child.
Is that
But
common?
there, yeah, it happens a lot, but I think nowadays more people are open to allowing some ongoing contact, or at least allowing the child to know who the parent is if they ever ask.
Hmm.
There's a lot more openness now. I'm finding that even with the agency older children adoption, there's a lot of the parents that are willing to set up some kind of an open agreement. It may not necessarily be face-to-face visits, but they'll have some kind of ongoing contact. So the child can ask those questions as they get older and maybe get medical information down the road that they might need.
Mm-hmm. And what are the other
The,
types of adoptions?
well, the others might be of course, there's been foreign adoptions where people will adopt a child from a foreign country. That has dropped off tremendously in the last few years.
For what
Part
reason?
of Part of it is financial because it's very costly to adopt from another country.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is political. For instance, 2 years ago, Russia closed all the adoptions of children from Russia, and some people were even in the process of adopting and then suddenly found out they were never going to get the child. There are some countries that they found were stealing children and not legally clearing them and kind of selling them on the black market.
That's not
So
good.
they closed those, and then an international committee developed a series of standards for foreign adoption, and it was called the Hague Convention. And that, in order to place a child from a foreign country, an agency in the United States has to belong to the Hague Convention, and it's $10,000 a year just to belong to that, to be able to be allowed to place children from certain countries. There's a few countries that don't require the Hague Convention, but an awful lot of them do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the agency that is doing the foreign adoption has to charge more to be able to cover that expense every year. And the family has to pay for the home study to be done by an agency in their state. Then they have to pay certain fees to the State Department for the immigration paperwork. And then they have to pay the foreign country. And many of these foreign countries require the families to go and stay there for at least 6 weeks and sometimes longer before they can bring the child back. So that's an expense for a lot of families. The average cost is close to $50,000, if not more.
Wow, that's a lot. And
Yeah,
Carolyn,
so it's dropped off tremendously. It's gone from like 20,000 placements a year down to like 2,000 a year. I mean, that drastically it's changed in the last 20 years.
and the popularity of that used to be that people thought that they were adopting children from maybe a healthier standpoint, and they actually found out that some of those kids were even more damaged than kids here, and they were looking to get the kids away from the birth parents so there'd never be communication, so they saw it as a little more permanent. What do you think of those two logics for reasoning?
Those were the reasons back then, and actually the logic for um, even the infant adoptions in this country for many years, up until at least the 70s and 80s, was that if you couldn't have a child, you could adopt a child, and you pretend that that child's yours. So everything was wiped out about the child's background. They created the new birth certificate with the adoptive parents' names on it. The whole child's background was wiped out, and that's what's happening to those adults now who were adopted as infants, who can't find out anything about themselves, and they feel like there's this hole in their life that's missing. But that was the society at the time. It was adoption was a way to create this magical family, and you didn't like many of the rich women didn't want to go through a pregnancy, and they would say, well, they could adopt, and then they could have their baby and not have to suffer the morning sickness and all of that. It was the ideal way to have a family, but we've learned that it's so harmful for all the people involved because these birth mothers who were forced to give up their children have suffered. Many of them never had another child, and they all lived with this guilt for so many years. And then the children grow up feeling like they love their adoptive families, but they still feel like they're missing something. And often they're missing a huge amount of medical information because whatever was given at the time they were placed, which was when they were an infant, is outdated by the time they're in their 20s and 30s when they start having medical issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that's been studied over the years and people realize now, but changing laws to keep up with it is really hard.
I could imagine that it's not easy adopting overseas. I think that a lot of people used to think it was. I agree that's totally changed over the years. Carolyn, I'm going to switch gears for a second so you can take a breather. And what I want to do is, first of all, tell people that they can call in with any questions that they have, comments, at 202-999-4699. We'll put the number back up in a couple of minutes. But we've also added that people can email, because what we found is sometimes when people are watching the videos live, especially through our feed through YouTube, it'll say that there's maybe 3, 4 people watching. We have other feeds out there as well. So it's not an accurate one, but most people seem to be watching. Go back and look at it later, and you'll find that, our first day, I think we're up to like 160 for views. So what we're asking people to do, if you have questions, even on older shows, while you're watching them or whatever, on that page where we have the link to bring you to the video where it has the date on georgesfamilymatters.org, you'll see that it says contact us. And you can write questions. Just include the date of the show. So you'd put like 12/05/16. You don't even have to put the title. We know what they are. And just ask your question about that show. We'll go back and ask the person that was on the show that day for the answers to those questions, and we'll share them on a Friday. Fridays are where we talk about all kinds of things. And that's a great way of doing it, so you can still get your questions in. And if you see a show coming up that you have a question, email us ahead of time, because we do show what's going to be coming after the show on Friday. We post for the coming week. Usually Saturday morning it's up there, so people kind of have a preview of what's coming. Feel free to email, because most people don't have 7 to 8 o'clock available so they can just kind of watch. One other thing that I want to address is a lot of people have asked to see what is the equipment behind the scenes. So I'm just going to go over it really quick. The smallest thing here is here. This is the MP3 player, which is the smallest, simplest thing we have. That's what plays that wonderful music at the beginning and end, and if you're on hold when you call in. This computer is where I make all the shots and everything that are going to be put out. It goes into this computer here, and it gives me, you can't really see it too well, but I'm pointing at it. This is where I put shots together. Like right now, if you look at the screen, I'm going to put together the shot that's going to have you and I in a second come on. So that's going to shoot over onto the internet through the different feeds that we use. It also brings all the sound over here, which is the phone, the music. Your call comes in through Skype. Callers come in through something called the call-in studio. It all gets mixed in through here, comes into this main computer here. This one handles phone calls, and back here, this monitors our live feed to make sure that we actually have sound so people understand. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a breather, Carol, and just kind of please people with the information that they've been kind of asking about. And I like questions, so feel free to email questions. I had most of my emails actually have been about the equipment that we use. Carolyn, we've talked about the process. Do you think we missed anything in the process of foster to adoption?
Well, there's so many things we can add to that, but
We're
usually
keeping the basics for today. I love talking with you. I think we'll have you come back, but in a basic sense, what do you think that you can add to it?
Well, one of the things I do like the families to think about if they're considering adoption is looking at the stability in their lives, because children come from some chaotic past sometimes, and it's important that the new parents can manage the life well so they can provide that role model and that stability for the child. Also, families would have to have commitment, because adoption is supposed to be permanent, and it does confuse the children if it doesn't end up being permanent. The children have suffered a lot of losses, and it's important for the family to stick through the rough times, which can happen more with older children, but sometimes it happens with a child that's still fairly young. Families need to have time because in the beginning of a placement, whether you have an infant or an older child, when the child's getting used to your home, you have a lot of meetings, a lot of doctor's appointments, scheduling different doctor's appointments, counseling if the child's older. If they're in school, you have all these school meetings. So it's going to take a lot of time away from your job or whatever you're doing, so you've got to prepare for that. And having resources, if families can identify their support system, who's the one that's going to be there to help and who's going to be there to give you a break once in a while if you need it. Looking at your extended family, your friends, your community, sometimes you can figure out which ones are going to be the strong ones and which ones aren't. And that's good for a family to look at before they consider if they're going to adopt or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's also good to, if you're married, to make sure the marriage is pretty strong because there's nothing that tests a marriage more than when you have kids. And if somebody needs a lot of time to themselves, it's going to be hard when you're first adjusting to that child because especially older children will constantly be watching you and wondering where you are because they're afraid if you're out of the room that you might be leaving them because they've been left before. So I've had parents telling me they wake up in the middle of the night and see this kid standing by the bed looking at them, but sometimes the children really need to know where you are at every minute. So if you're the kind of person that needs a lot of time to yourself and you don't want to be bothered with that, you might struggle when you have a child in your home. Also, I always tried to tell families that you may not get the gratitude from the child, even when you give them a lot of things. Yeah.
Do you get
You're
that from
laughing, I know.
Do you get that from birth children though? How many birth children?
No, you don't.
My daughter gave me
They,
gratitude when she was about 18 or 19, somewhere around there. She wrote me the most beautiful Father's Day card. I waited 18 to 19 years for that. I was happy with it, believe me, but there's no gratitude.
oh, I know. But I was amazed at the number of parents that would tell me, well, gee, I got them a bike, I got them all these things that they never had before, and they don't even seem to appreciate anything. For a lot of these kids, material things don't do it. So
Oh,
it doesn't have the meaning for them. But like you say, your birth kids are that way too. So many times people will say your child will never appreciate you as a parent until they become a parent or until they get to be an adult.
mm-hmm.
So if you're somebody that really needs gratitude, you're going to be
Very
disappointed.
disappointed. Carolyn, I want to get back to something that I was going to ask you earlier. I said I'd remember my question because I wrote it down. I have a pen. Um,
Oh, good.
yeah, it comes in handy too. I want to remind people 202-999-4699, questions, comments. And again, you can email us at any time, even if you're watching this in a year from now. Carolyn, you mentioned that things were very different 30 years ago, that the adoptions, the type of adoption that was happening was very different. What happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years? Now, I know you weren't around 50 years ago, but 30 years ago, you probably heard the stories of 10, 20 years ago. So, in your opinion, what's happened to adoption over the years that it's changed from adopting a baby to an agency that really I don't even think was around, taking children from people and placing them with other families? That just didn't happen. So, what changed to cause this?
Well, I think there was always the public agencies that took children from families. If the child couldn't go back, often those kids ended up staying in a congregate setting, like an orphanage or a residential center, because they didn't believe that anybody was willing to take a child beyond infancy. So for many, many years, the only children that were placed for adoption were infants, probably under a year and maybe up to 2. But when I first started about 30 years ago, a 3-year-old was considered extremely hard to place.
Wow. Even though
because they
nowadays, Carolyn, there's not lines of people waiting either at this point, are there?
no, there aren't lines, but I think people realize that many times it's people that have already had children and they've experienced the different ages and they're comfortable with that. There still are a lot of families that want to adopt an infant to start from the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we see more and more people who feel. I had a lot of families come that say they were never comfortable with the infant stage because the child is so helpless and they can't verbalize what they want. A lot of those families did so much better with older children because they could communicate with the child if that's was was what they were more comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So it's changed. The attitudes have changed. Also, I think as studies came out showing that congregate care wasn't the best setting for most kids, that they began moving away into foster care more on a permanent basis, and then they realized some of these foster parents were willing to adopt children, and that's where the older child placement actually started, was when they approached the foster family when the child became free for adoption and said, would you be interested in adopting the child? And so there became more and more foster parents who were willing. And that's actually how adoption subsidies started, because the foster parents had been paid a subsidy to do foster care, and they didn't want that to be the barrier for them adopting if they felt they couldn't afford to lose the money.
Mm-hmm. Carolyn, I want to transition. You said something important about kindness. And at the beginning of the show, I said how to tell a struggling soul that there is love in this world. And the quote that I'm putting up right now, it kind of links into what you just said about people adopting older kids. It's kind of an act of kindness. People realize that these kids need homes too. They have their own kids. In my case, I had children already. And it was what people did for me when I was younger, the kindness that I've seen. The quote that I'm putting up right now is kindness. What a simple way to tell another struggling soul that there is love to be found in this world. Do you think that the act of adoption and foster care is an act of kindness?
Yeah, I think that has to be the start of it. Certainly, if it is just kindness or just trying to do a good thing, you've got to have more to you than that, and that's why I was listing the things that you should look at and evaluating yourself. Because just the act of kindness isn't necessarily going to make that child feel completely safe and loved. They've got to know that you're truly committed to them and that you're in for the long run and that you can put up with the rough times. And that's why so many kids test the parents so drastically, because they're always waiting for what is it going to be that causes this family to say you're out. And they test you constantly trying to find that, and it's when they realize that you're not going to give up that they really feel like they can be loved here and be safe here.
Okay, and Carolyn, the next quote that I'm going to put up, and anybody can call in and comment on that quote. The next quote that I want to talk about, you said earlier how parents don't get the gratitude. They go out and buy them a new bike and they don't get the gratitude. And I thought that this was another very interesting quote for you tonight. And what it reads is, don't buy me everything you wish you could have had growing up. Um, Teach me everything you wish you would have known growing up. So instead of buying things, teach me things. Teach me the things that or wish you had known. Um, what do you think about that in terms of
I think
adoption and foster care?
I think it is very true, because in fact, that the exercise that I often did with the parents was that guided fantasy that you pretend you're going to be moving to a new home, and then you talk about them driving down a street and coming up, and this house is much nicer than the house they came from. The neighborhood's much nicer, and you go up and knock on the door, and how do you feel? And most of those people, even though they're planning to adopt, they realize the feeling of standing at that doorway, waiting for that door to open, and who's going to be on the other side. And even if it's a nicer house with better things and a lot of nice belongings, is that still going to make them feel safe and loved? So I always cautioned families to, whatever the child comes with, don't get rid of it right away. A lot of times the children will, because they're in their honeymoon and they want you to like them and they want to be, they want to fit in. They'll say, "Oh, get rid of all those, and I love these new clothes, and I'd love to have all this new stuff." But at some point, what they came with, no matter how tattered or small or whatever it was, is going to mean something to them. So I always suggested to families to put those things in a box in the attic, but don't throw them away. And a year from then, when the child is having some homesickness or whatever, they can go through that box and see some of the things that they had in their previous foster home. Sometimes they have things that came from their birth parents. And it's easy for the new parents to want to give them all new stuff and get rid of all the old stuff, but that old stuff is still part of them. So,
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's more important to give your kids attention, to give them what they really need. And it's not a new bike. You're not going to get gratitude. You're more likely to get a hug because you played a game with them and they won and made you look like a fool. And they get up jumping up and down. They're excited and they give you a hug because they won. That's probably
yeah.
where you're going to get more gratitude. Carolyn, we only have a few minutes left, but classes. What kind of classes do they have, and what do they go over in those classes? And try to keep it a little bit on the short side because we are running a little short on time. But just I want to touch base on what kind of classes are available for parents.
Well, the classes will differ from state to state, and actually in each state, if you go through a private agency, they might have different classes than the state does. But in general, the classes usually include something about where the children come from. How do they end up in care? So there's discussion on physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, all the reasons why a child might end up not with their birth parents. And of course, there would be, if you were looking for an infant or a young child or a child from a foreign country, there'd be discussion on the voluntary surrender of children. Then there should be a time when they talk about the grief and loss around adoption, what happens when they separate from one family to the next, and how they need to grieve that at some point. Helping children with attachments, what excuse me, what develops an attachment and how you can help build on that. Helping children, helping the family actually with discipline and understanding how to handle the child's behaviors. I think most places that I've looked at cover all of those things. But there might be other factors, other exercises to do to try to help you evaluate yourselves and look at your own family situation, how you can reach out to other adoptive parents for support. That life book, how you can make that if it hasn't been done for the child ahead of time. So I think the skills for adoptive parents is trying to help them know how children grow, know where they're coming from, and understand that these kids will always be a little bit socially behind. With each trauma they've suffered, they probably have lost a year of development. So most children who are 12 are really much more like 8 or 10
Are you saying
in
that
their
trauma
overall.
stunts the development of maturity?
Yeah, because
I would
if
agree. I'm
they
just
get,
asking.
yeah, because I've seen people who have, if they have a diagnosis, say of a mental illness at 18, they're kind of stuck at 18 for a while.
Hmm.
They don't necessarily progress until they really can get a handle on what happened to them. And the same thing could be with a car accident or another traumatic event.
So, Carolyn, let me ask you with classes, are there any classes that you wish could be added? You know, if you had a wish list of something that you say, gee, I wish this could be added. Because in my book, having gone through 9 adoptions, the class that comes to my mind right off the bat is therapy. I wish that there were classes on childhood disorders, therapies that are effective, how to find a therapist, what kind of therapist. I mean, all things around that. I've done a lot of learning on my own. However, I wish that there was a class that could have introduced the thought, even to get me going at a earlier point would have been much more helpful. So, as a professional that's been in the business for 30 years, what would you like to see added or see, a need for?
That's a good one for sure. Probably helping people navigate the system,
Mm-hmm.
just what the placement's going to be and what the process is going to be. I don't think we spend enough time on that for families. And what I hear from families who have gone through the public system, they really wish they had a better handle on the court process, how the child comes into care, what the court's role in the whole lifespan of the child is, until they get to the point of determination. Because a lot of these families are just flying blindly trying to figure out, well, what's the next step, and when does this happen, and when does that happen? And it is very confusing if agencies don't spend time telling these families the process.
Mm-hmm. So just spend more time with that.
Yeah. The problem is when you have a family come to an agency, no matter what the agency is, and ask about adoption, if they're told there's going to be 10 classes or 5 classes or 6 classes, at that point the family doesn't really understand what could possibly be in these classes.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a child yourselves, you don't have to take all these classes. So what is the difference? And there is a big difference because you still have to understand that child has other parts of them, that other family members, and that even if you adopt an infant, someday that child's going to ask questions. So you've got to be comfortable with that whole process to be able to answer those questions.
And I think what an understatement to say that the kids are going to have different needs than your children that were born into your family. They have very different needs. So those classes, I know when they told us about the first classes, I rolled my eyes. I was like, I have kids. What do I need that for? Boy, did I need those classes. Carolyn, as far as I'm concerned, I have a call of action for people. If you're going to adopt, if you're going to do foster care, look for articles and books on the goals that talk about the goals that you have. So if you want to do foster care, read up about it. If you want to do adoption, if you want to do both, read up on it. Study on it. Talk to people about it. Go see a therapist. Even if you don't have the child yet in therapy, go find an attachment therapist and talk about what could go on. George's Family Matters, again, we have lots of resources available. You can call us, you can email us. Get educated beforehand. In a closing summary of maybe 30 seconds to a minute, what would you say? Anything else that you want to throw out there that comes to your mind? Any tips or anything?
Well, I think what you just said is good to educate yourself. Also, if you have a way of getting a list of the agencies in your state, try to get a better feel for which one you feel comfortable with, because adoption is a personal decision. It's a very emotional decision sometimes, and if you're working with an agency that you're comfortable with, you'll be more likely to feel good about the whole process. If you're working with an agency that you feel is too demanding or too authoritarian or whatever,
Hmm.
you might have difficulty with the whole placement because you just don't feel comfortable with the people you're working with.
Well, Carolyn, thank you. Today's show was Foster Adoption 101 with Carolyn Goodridge, the basic ABCs. Carolyn, thank you for being on the show and have a good night.
Oh,
For
you're welcome.
And for everyone else, I just want to remind you that tomorrow night, I think is going to be an amazing show. It's Losing Your Birth Family with Carlos Herraz, A Little Boy's Confusion. It's going to be very difficult for him. If anybody has stories about loss that they had of their birth family, adoptions that they've either been through themselves or know someone, that'd be greatly appreciative as a support for him to hear from people as well. So, thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm George Haraz for George's Family Matters Live. Thank you.